The Greater Boston population has been getting more diverse for the past few decades, but new research points to a changing pattern. The diversity we think of as urban is spreading farther out, partly driven by gentrification. These are among the findings in a report called The Changing Faces of Greater Boston, a collaboration between Boston Indicators and research institutes at UMass and UMass Boston. To tell us about the report are the research manager with Boston Indicators, Trevor Mattos, and the director of the Gastón Institute for Latino Community Development and Public Policy at UMass Boston, Lorna Rivera. Thank you both for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
I want to start with that big picture, Trevor. What did you see?
Sure, yeah, what we have seen is an absolutely striking picture of demographic change throughout our region. In the past 25 years or so, more than 90% of our region's population growth has actually been driven by immigration, by the foreign-born population. And in particular, not just immigrants, but immigrants of color. And so we've seen not only communities of color within the city, but certainly well beyond the city proper, expanding significantly. And this is also taking place alongside a decline in the white population of our region.
Now, it's not new that people, let's say, move from the city to the suburbs because of upward mobility, but I'm sure there's more than that going on here.
Sure, this is absolutely a question of affordability in the city. We're seeing issues of gentrification and displacement taking place within the city proper, and we're seeing families and communities of color, and really even white families as well, long-standing white communities within the city looking for more affordable alternatives that are still accessible to the business center here in the city.
Lorna Rivera, you looked at a smaller area very closely, and one of these areas was East Boston. What did you see there?
Yeah, so East Boston has really been one of the communities most affected by the high cost of housing and the lack of affordable housing and gentrification. In East Boston, we focused there because 54% of the population are Latinos, and it has always been an immigrant community. 1980s, we had Italians, Cambodians, Vietnamese, Brazilians in East Boston. But then there's been this really, since 1990, 3 times the growth in the Latino population. So we wanted to focus there and really look at as well, what is driving, some of the housing displacement of Latino communities. Where are they going? They're leaving East Boston. But also how it's affecting other immigrant groups in East Boston as well.
Well, in East Boston, I imagine one of the things that drew them there was maybe jobs at Logan Airport. Mm-hmm. Now, if they have to go to those jobs and they live in Lawrence, I mean, what does that mean?
Yeah, in fact, many folks from East, particularly focused on Colombians in East Boston, although there are more Salvadoreños that live in East Boston. And many of them are moving out to places like Rivera and Everett and Lynn. We haven't heard of going far out as to Lawrence, but certainly we're losing those populations. And it's having an impact on the enrollments at the high school and some of the local schools, which then has an impact on the kind of funding that the schools then in East Boston can receive, right? And so there's a lot of other implications of what's happening in terms of the housing affordability. It's then going to lead to people moving out and then less resources for the public schools.
The funding, I guess it means if you have fewer students, there's less money, and you might have to change the curriculum because if you don't have as many ESL students, for example, you got to do something different, right?
Sure. Although, the population in East Boston, the students, I'm really throughout the whole school district of Boston Public Schools, is a third of the students are English learners. And, as well, 42% Latinos. So there's going to still be that population, as the report shows. The future generations are going to be U.S. born. That's where the majority, at least for Latinos, will be U.S. born Latinos. And so there will definitely still be a need for bilingual education in East Boston schools, but throughout the school district.
Trevor, when I looked at the report, one thing that really got my attention was seeing that there are more mortgages to black home buyers in Brockton than in all the city of Boston. Did I get that correct?
That is correct, yeah. Another really incredible number to emerge from the research that we did and some other work that's been done. So, you know, of course, the historic center really of the African American and the black community in Boston has been Roxbury, but we've seen the cost of living and the cost of housing in particular go up significantly. And despite the fact that Boston is 7 times the size of Brockton, over 20% of mortgages to black homebuyers and African American homebuyers is going to the city of Brockton.
Now, another concern here is reflecting this population change in the leadership profile, which could mean politics and some other things. What do you see as the challenge there?
Certainly, yeah. This is something that we really wanted to take a good hard look at in the research that we did. I think collectively our research team thinks of this incredible diversity as an asset for our region, but it's certainly not going to be as easy to lift up these communities and to see them having an impact locally if they're not able to take part in the decision-making institutions in our region. And so whether that's civic organizations and community-based organizations or state-level legislative bodies and the like, communities of color in the labor force now make up roughly 1/3 of the working population in Greater Boston, but don't even reach 15% of those in positions of power, such as legislators or CEOs that are running organizations in our region. And we view this as a place where we really need to put in a whole lot more work.
Well, Rivera, immigrants don't just have problems, they make contributions too. What did you see in East Boston, especially to the economy in the neighborhood?
Well, thank you for asking, because the Gastón Institute has been doing research on the contributions of immigrant entrepreneurs in East Boston starting in the 2000s. We did 2 reports, one in 2006 that looked at Colombian entrepreneurs, and really the kinds of contributions that immigrants make are significant. They tend to be self-employed. They tend to employ, people in the community. They give back through these small businesses to fund, after-school programs, and their business leaders end up really being vital to the economic development. And particularly in East Boston, if it wasn't for the Colombian businesses around Maverick Square, for example, that area would not have been revitalized without, right, the sort of that innovation that was brought by Colombian immigrants in particular. And even what other contributions are besides the economy is, in East Boston, we did interviews with police and other stakeholders to find that, it made the neighborhood safer, as well as had other quality of life improvements because of what immigrants have brought.
Trevor, another thing that struck me is the contrast between a neighborhood like Hyde Park and the city as a whole. In the latter, you have very wealthy people in high-rise buildings and a lot of people of color in subsidized housing. But in Hyde Park, it's quite a different story.
Yes, the case study that we did on Hyde Park was one of the most fascinating parts of this project, in my opinion. I might be a little biased because I did that work, but what we see is the level of educational attainment has increased. Incomes are relatively high, especially when you compare incomes for folks of color versus their counterparts citywide. So you see incomes for African American or black heads of household being roughly double. And the same is true for the Latino people that are living down in Hyde Park. There's a relatively small Asian American community down there, but it's really transformed that community that historically was an Irish American, Italian American stronghold, thinking back to the era of Mayor Menino. And so it's changed quite a bit, and it's continuing to change very rapidly.
Another thing here, we've been talking about people as if they stay in silos forever, but a lot of intermarriage too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And another place that we looked at just outside of the city, but in some ways arguably just as connected as Hyde Park, if not more, is the city of Malden, which is right on the Orange Line. It's actually geographically closer to downtown Boston than Hyde Park is. And that's a place that is now one of the most diverse places in the entire region. Back in 1990, it was 88% white, and today it has a very rich mix across all major racial and ethnic groups. And this is leading to growth in the multiracial population. We're seeing individual families increasingly forming across racial and ethnic lines.
Well, I guess you've seen some of that. What did you make of it?
I think it's reflective of also what's happening nationally, not just in Boston. I think that with the way that we're also going to be counting populations with the next census, that will also be further complex. The complexity of the way that people choose and identify their racial and ethnic identities is going to become even more complex in the next census, because we're going to be allowed to really identify our specific ancestries, as well as there's going to be different multiracial categories. So it's going to be, the future of this country is going to be, I'm really projecting out here. There's going to be a much more significant growth, definitely, in multiracial families.
Trevor, what about housing? I know people will move wherever it's cheapest, maybe, but aside from that, I mean, isn't there something else that has to be done to take care of what's happening?
In terms of the question of affordability in the city?
At least providing supply or something like that.
Absolutely. I mean, the question when you look outside of the city of Boston into the broader region, and you see this issue of exclusionary zoning practices and really intense restrictions on the level of density that can be built, that's quite problematic, and really putting families where you want to be close to the job center in Boston, but at the same time you want to be able to raise a family, you want to be able to have a good quality of life and afford the other things that you need. And so it really gets back to this question of housing, which is an issue being dealt with currently. There's debates going on at the state level, at the city level, and even in the cities throughout the greater Boston region.
Lorna, what about education? A century ago, immigrants would just go to work in factories and that would be it. But these days, for the economic growth that we need, what about the role of education in matching up with the population here?
Well, definitely, in Boston area, even, places we wrote about, Waltham in this report, where the jobs are in technology and in that industry as well, biotech, and where we need to be doing a better job of creating, vocational programs and job training in those areas. But in order to access the best paying jobs in those industries, which is what our strength is in Massachusetts, you need to have higher education. You need to have a bachelor's at least. And so we do still need to, have more improvement there. However, the immigrants in Massachusetts the report shows, right, we also have very highly educated immigrant workforce here, more so than nationally. So we have sort of the two spectrums. We have lower educated, immigrants, and then highly educated immigrants. And so they're making contributions in very significant ways. But there's still, again, some challenges there.
And finally, Trevor, I know there's more of this report than we can cover even here, but if people want to find out more, is there a place they can go to get that online?
Absolutely, yeah. At our website, bostonindicators.org, you can find an interactive map of some of the data that you can play around with, as well as the different sections of the report.
And of course, Lorna, you've got a website with plenty of research at the Gastón Institute too, right?
That's right. We've done several, studies around immigrant communities, particularly in different, regions throughout the state. We're not just focused on Boston, so if folks are interested in looking at their own towns and where the diversity is there, please check out our website and you can download our reports.
Thank you both very much. Lorna Rivera from the Gastón Institute and Trevor Mattos from Boston Indicators.